It's interesting she should talk about lines being drawn. We were just talking about that in the first segment, about lines and spheres of influence.
Yes, I think we started moving a line and redrawing it when we began to expand NATO over Russia's opposition. And when we did so at first, the first expansion, which occurred in the Clinton administration, against the objection of many of us, because we said this is going to redivide Europe. We need, if we're going to have peace in Europe, we need a security organization that includes Russia, with responsibilities, along with the privileges that that gives them. But no, we decided to move what had been a Cold War organization, and a successful one, into a situation which inevitably would have begun to redivide Europe if it were pushed too far. And we told the Russians, look, don't worry, this is a defensive organization. It is incapable of carrying out offensive operations. And of course, you're not threatening these countries. Don't worry. Next thing they knew, NATO, without UN approval, was bombing Serbia, an act of war, when no NATO country had been attacked by Serbia. Now, I think, again, there were real humanitarian issues there that needed to be dealt with. But instead of dealing with them diplomatically and attempting to get solutions so that if violence were necessary, we could get UN approval. Instead, we went ahead and said, well, NATO decided to do it.
On that issue, though, if I may, the Russians certainly were against any activity aimed at the Serbs.
Yes.
And the Russians were probably, I would presume, and you could tell me whether you believe this or not, probably likely to veto in the Security Council any military action aimed at the Serbs, no?
I think that given, yes, once we started expanding NATO against their opposition, yes. But if our diplomatic position had been, look, we don't need to expand NATO. We need security cooperation with Russia and the others. Russia's responsibility is to make sure either that Serbia behaves itself, or if it isn't, it must vote with us in the Security Council for appropriate action. And if we had taken that stance, I think either Russia could have kept Milosevic under a certain control, or would have been so annoyed at Milosevic's going against it that they would have voted with us in the UN. In other words, a different diplomacy, instead of simply expanding NATO and then using NATO to supplant the UN. So it takes diplomacy to get Russian approval. I would point out that in the case of the first Gulf War, President Bush, the 41st, was very careful to get Gorbachev to vote with us in the UN to take the necessary action, even though Iraq had been an ally, in effect, of the Soviet Union. But this was on grounds that you can't allow one country to invade another.
Let me ask you this, because you have the perspective that so few have had. I mean, you've known that country, both as Russia and the Soviet Union, for decades. You've seen these leaders up close. You know of them in a way that few Americans, if any, do at this stage. You mentioned Gorbachev.
Yes.
We now have Putin. Gorbachev is seen in the West as being a reasonable man. He gave us glasnost. He gave us perestroika. Putin, to many, is portrayed as a modern-day Stalin, a KGB. Your impressions?
He did come out of the KGB, of course, in his training, but out of the external intelligence side of it. You know, I would remind people that President Bush the Elder was also head of the CIA for a while, although that's not quite the same. I think, to be honest, I think President Putin tried at the beginning to cooperate. I think that he made it his first priority to bring Russia into Europe and to improve the economy, because it was about collapse when he became president. You may recall that he was the first foreign leader to call President Bush and pledge solidarity after 9/11. He then unilaterally withdrew their base in Cuba. He unilaterally withdrew the base that they still held in Cam Ranh Bay in Vietnam. in effect, without asking anything in return.
So these are gestures
He removed irritants to the relationship. So what do? One thing, we walk out of the ABM Treaty, which had been, even though he said, I'm willing to amend it, let's work together on a missile defense. No, we're going to walk out of it. We need a free hand. And then issue after issue, then there was the invasion of Iraq. Russia's position, which was the same as France and Germany, was that we don't believe there are any weapons of mass destruction there. And if you think they are, let's let the inspectors go and find them. Because if they are, sure, they should be attacked. But if they're not, no. Well, without any real evidence, in fact, distorting the evidence, we said, get lost, we're going. So issue after issue, and then I was speaking before about Serbia and Kosovo. Then most recently, when we began to talk about recognizing the independence of Kosovo, which is not truly independent, it's a ward of NATO. The government cannot keep peace there without NATO peacekeepers. And yet, when they declared independence, we said, oh yeah, the Kosovars will not live with the Serbs anymore. They have a right to independence. And the Russians said, even before that happened, look, if you do this, the same is going to apply to places like South Ossetia and Abkhazia and Precedent, one of the enclaves near Moldova. And I don't know, we just said, oh, we don't see any connection. And yet there is more similarity than there is a difference. There are differences in each of these. And in the final analysis, then we began to talk about bringing both Georgia and Ukraine into NATO.
NATO as well.